present keynote speaker of this symposium, Sarah Hammerschlag. Sarah Hammerschlag is an assistant professor of religion and literature at the University of Chicago Divinity School. She is the author of The Figural Jew, Politics and Identity in Post-War French Thought, published at the University of Chicago Press in 2010. She is currently at work on 3 projects: an anthology of French Jewish thought for Randis University Press, a book on the Renaissance of Judaism in post-war Paris entitled Sowers and Sages for the University of Chicago Press as well, and finally a book for Columbia University Press entitled Broken Tablets, Lévinas, Derrida, and the Translation of Religion. Thank you, Sarah, for being with us at this symposium, and please join me in welcoming Sarah.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you, Bruno and Laura, for all the work you've done on this conference. It is truly a pleasure to be here discussing this topic, one that's obviously dear to my heart. And having struggled with the topic for many years in isolation, it's so wonderful to have a chance to speak to some of my interlocutors, which I only struggled with in my head for so many years, to finally have that conversation out loud. When Bruno asked me to give this talk, he asked me to talk about the book. And I admit the book, which was first written as my dissertation in 2006, felt a little bit far back in the past. And so in some sense I feel it's difficult to be accountable, but I'm going to do my best for words written so long ago. So I wanted to try and relate the project of that book to one of my current projects, which is this book on Lévinas and Derrida, and particularly through the theme of being Jewish, which is obviously key to the first book. And I am excited to have the conversation that clearly has already begun in some sense thanks to Bruno's illuminating remarks. So I'm going to, I have a PowerPoint presentation. All right, so you have my title. All the rest is literature, Lévinas, Derrida, and the legacy of being Jewish. As the recent publication of Heidegger's Black Notebooks once again underscores, Heidegger and others deployed the figure of the Jew as nomad and prophet of empty rationality, with the darkest of motives and with the most dire of consequences. As Gregory Freed and Richard Polk's edition of Heidegger's 1933-1934 seminar on the essence and concept of nature, history, and state reveals, Heidegger's assignation of the Jews as Semitic nomads was made in the service of justifying policies of state persecution and political elimination. Semites, according to Heidegger, could neither learn to participate in the German state nor form an authentic people of their own. What is at stake then in the post-war chapter of this story, in which a series of French theorists, critics, and philosophers chose not to disprove or dismiss this trope, but to embrace it, and in so doing perform its revalorization? How could it serve as a tool in their efforts to rethink politics and identity in the post-war period? As I argue in The Figural Jew, the post-war revalorization of uprootedness and marginality in the figure of the Jew was one of the means by which some French thinkers sought to distance themselves from pre-war nationalism, from its neo-pagan romanticism, its embrace of a discourse of blood and soil, and to do so without returning to the Republican universalism against which French nationalism had defined itself in the early decades of the 20th century. Could this revalorization take place, however, without providing its own mythic representation of the Jew? As Nancy and Lacoulabart describe in their analysis of Nazi ideologue Alfred Rosenberg's The Myth of the 20th Century, myth represents a past for which the only reference is itself. It creates community by providing an origin narrative and installing a nexus for the political subject's identification with that community. Myth, according to this definition, should be considered as an analog to what Heidegger in the 1934 session of his seminar treated as the will of the people, its formation and consolidation into a form which cannot be reduced to the aggregate of the wills of its members. Rosenberg himself dismissed the Jew as the rejection of myth, much as Heidegger deemed the Semitic nomads incapable of forming a true people. Consequently, one could say that to speak of the mythic Jew is an oxymoron. And yet, insofar as the notion of the exilic Jews as the anti-mythic people functions as an ideal for identification, a means of identity formation, the anti-mythic Jew would seem to mimic the logic itself of mythical thinking, thus making the figure of the Jew mythically anti-mythic. The task of the figural Jew, and indeed of some of the figures covered in it, was to discern whether there were modes or procedures of redeploying this figure without its reification, and indeed to discern what political ends such a redeployment would and could serve. One interesting figure missing from Bruno's discussion is the figure Emmanuel Lévinas, who will, for the most part, be the focus of my talk today. No doubt in this narrative, Emmanuel Lévinas serves as the most pivotal, but also the most problematic case, because it was his redeployment of the deracinated Jew as a model for the ethnic subject that gave rise to numerous other attempts, including Maurice Blanchot's, Jean-François Lyotard's, and Jacques Derrida's, to re-engage the trope, but also because in Lévinas' own representation of the figure of the Jew, he actively cultivated its function in community formation, and was thus also the inspiration for other more communitarian efforts such as Divinity and Georges Consul's. In fact, Lévinas' recently published wartime journals reveal that he not only recognized in the trope a means of identity formation, he saw himself as readapting the strategies of Heidegger's philosophy for Jewish aims, reproducing its very logic with a different set of value coordinates at its core. Even Rosenberg is explicitly mentioned in the notebooks as one in a list of 4 themes he intended to treat philosophically. The other 3 are being nothingness, time, and Franz Rosenzweig. Along with other notes, many of which are on the election of suffering, it seems incontestable that Lévinas saw himself performing something like a transvaluation of values, recasting Heidegger's thinking, and by implication Nazi ideology more generally, by reversing its terms. The question I want to pursue today is whether a transvaluation is enough to divest Lévinas' thinking of some of the problematic implications of Heidegger's. Lévinas pursued the project of theorizing Judaism in post-war Paris as one element in a larger strategy to resuscitate the Jewish tradition and to treat it as a source for engaging with Europe's contemporary political dilemmas. Elsewhere, in the project Stars and Sages, I contend that the use of the trope by these thinkers shaped their engagement with Zionism in such a way that the form their own Zionism took was messianic and religious. While I won't flesh out the claim here, I mention it to give one sense of how and why the recasting of the Jew in mythic terms can have problematic political consequences. One critic of this endeavor by Lévinas and others, particularly as it took shape in the Colloque des inspections juives de langue française, was Jacques Derrida, who at the same time has declared himself to be working on a project co-extensive with Lévinas' own. He claimed, in fact, in an interview that between him and Lévinas there were no philosophical differences, only differences of idiom, of ways of proceeding, of history, and of inscriptions connected to the biographical aspect. Today, I'd like to consider these differences in idiom, particularly as they pertain to discourses of literature and religion. It was, I contend, by insisting on the imbrication of these 2 discourses, religion and literature, that Derrida was able to salvage the notion of being Jewish from Lévinas, and to insist, indeed, that his own interpretation was germane to Lévinas's all along. One of the means by which such a transformation was performed was through a shared recourse to irony. Again, something I think that Bruno and I can discuss the role of irony on this. Derrida recognized the ways in which Lévinas himself utilized irony towards a consolidation of community, and he exploited the instability inherent in any ironic operation in order to represent it in an anti-mythic literary realm. Now let me say right off the bat, these 2 categories, literature and religion, may seem indeterminate. They are, of course, inherently historical and shifting, but they were terms and categories that Lévinas and Derrida both utilized as they each set out to redescribe the Heideggerian landscape. They were terms which, at the moment of Lévinas and Derrida's first engagement in 1964, were a part of a larger historical and public debate, terms which were being defined and redefined across the journals of Les Contes Modernes, Critique, and Tel Quel from the late 1940s through the early 1960s. It is also worth noting that the same scholastic year in which Derrida penned Violence and Metaphysics, initiating a conversation between himself and Lévinas that would last for close to 40 years, he taught a seminar at the Sorbonne on irony. What must a Jewish thinker be? Let me take you briefly to one of the last chapters of Lévinas and Derrida's engagement before returning to its roots. In 1998, 2 years after Lévinas's death, Derrida spoke at the Colloque des Intellectuels Juifs de l'Enfance. For the previous 35 years, this often annual, occasionally biennial, meeting of French-speaking Jewish intellectuals had been the clearest forum for Lévinas, through his Talmudic lectures, to bring up the notion of being Jewish, which he had first announced in 1947 in the essay Être Juif. In coming to speak at the colloque after many years of absence, Derrida emphasized his proximity to Lévinas, as he had consistently for the previous 30 years, despite essays which marked very clear divisions between the two thinkers. But he also zeroed in on the very issue of being Jewish and the role this mode of being had played as the source of the two thinkers' proximity and the source of their differences. So in 1998, he opened with a story indeed about Lévinas and irony, about the last time Derrida recalled being at the colloque in 1965, soon after the two had become friends. You have a quote from Derrida's paper up there. Before beginning, I recall what Emmanuel Lévinas told me on that day in an aside, and which I also evoked on the day of his death. I recount in the present tense, as is done sometimes in the rhetoric of historians, in order to make things more tangible for representation. Lévinas on that day says something which resonates otherwise concerning what living together might mean for the Jews, living or not. André Neher was in the middle of speaking. Lévinas whispers in my ear, "You see him? He's the Protestant. Me, I'm the Catholic." The quip would call for an infinite commentary. To unpack this comment, let's begin with Lévinas's joke. It has multiple levels. It referred to the fact that Neher gave biblical readings at the colloque and Lévinas Talmudic. Lévinas was interested in the apparatus of commentary, Neher in reading the biblical canon itself. On another level, it was at the expense of the colloque itself, suggesting that its project to read contemporary problems and questions through a Jewish lens, to reclaim Judaism from the anti-Semitic dogma that in Heidegger's terms viewed the tradition as poor and world, to claim it as an original and significant source. Philosophical in its own right, pertinent and distinct, a tradition indeed of Weltanschauung, that this project could be recast in Christian terms, thus undermining the very platform of the colloque. Furthermore, it was a joke that distanced Lévinas from his colleagues. It was made to Derrida as an aside. It thus opened an ironic distance between Lévinas and the other participants, and in the process established Lévinas's proximity to Derrida. It was a joke characteristic of the way in which Lévinas consistently used irony throughout his corpus, but particularly in his Jewish writings. Irony was such a trademark of Lévinas's speech that Derrida referred to it in his eulogy for him. When asked in an interview to characterize Lévinas, Henri Attelin described him as acerbic in his critique of everything and everyone and very ironic. Most often, Lévinas's irony was deployed to establish an inside and an outside. It often functioned as a call to the members of the audience to determine which side they were on. Did you identify for a moment with the position that Lévinas was critiquing? Did you find yourself on the outside? Or were you on the inside? Were you able to stand with Lévinas to condemn Heidegger or Nietzsche, Levi-Strauss or Levi-Bruhl, nationalism or barbarism? In commenting on the story in 1998, Derrida immediately called attention to its ironic dimension, but in so doing, he asked about the impact of that irony on the very issue of being Jewish. Does the use of such irony disrupt its mythic deployment? As I mentioned, Lévinas had in 1947 published an essay entitled Being Jewish. It was one of his earliest essays published after the war, and it was clearly framed as a response to Sartre's reflections sur la question juive. I'll return to it in a moment. No doubt it was in play in Derrida's comments. What must a Jewish thinker be, Derrida asked, to use this language? Que doit être un penseur juif pour tenir ce langage? What is the being of a Jewish thinker that he can use this language? Derrida continued. What must a Jewish thinker be to use this language with the profundity of seriousness and the lightness of irony that we hear in it? How can he remain a Jew together with himself while opening himself to another probable or improbable Jew, in this case me, who's never felt very Catholic and above all not Protestant, a Jew who, coming from another shore of Judaism than Neher and Lévinas, a Mediterranean shore, immediately remarks in the abyss of these doubles or of this Judeo-Catholic Protestant triangle the absence of the Islamo-Abrahamic. Derrida seems here in his response, despite his attestations of proximity, to resist Lévinas and to resist him multiply. He resists the space of intimacy that Lévinas had himself opened up with his aside, whispering in his ear. For there he was sharing the story with those about whom it was actually originally told. He resists the very assumption of understanding upon which the joke was predicated by inquiring after its meaning. Indeed, he resists the very unity of something like being Jewish. But he also seems to be asking whether Lévinas's quip resists it as well, whether or not Lévinas realized that himself. How then should we read the assertion of proximity and intimacy to Lévinas, which Derrida had commenced his talk at the colloque? Was it ironic? If so, to what ends? We'll come back to these questions. From Dasein to being Jewish. Now let us back up and consider Lévinas's notion of being Jewish. But let's go back even further than the 1947 essay. The recent publication of Lévinas's wartime notebooks has, for the first time, given us the opportunity to track the transformation of his thinking during World War II and in a lager near Hanover, Germany. These 7 notebooks contain an astonishing variety of material. Among scraps of novels he was writing, comments on Proust, Marie Antoinette, Anatole France, we find the following note: partir du Dasein ou partir du J. This is closely followed by the note J comme catégorie. As later notes confirm, this J is short for Judaism. What is important about the note and the one that follows is not that they reveal Lévinas' thinking about Judaism during his captivity. There are many notes that establish that fact. What's striking is the connection between Dasein and Judaism, as though they are somehow parallel terms. What was at stake in establishing that parallel? Most clearly, Lévinas was concerned to distance himself from Heidegger, a project which he most clearly took up in Existence and Existence, published also in 1947, through the recasting of a description of being from the Heideggerian Es gibt, a fruitful plenitude of which man is the shepherd, into the terrifying description of anonymous being, a description in which the bare facts of life in the lager become the source for a philosophical description of being itself. But at the same time, the parallel reminds us that to some extent Lévinas accepted the cultural and historical terms of Heidegger's project. In paragraph 75 of Being in Time, we find this description of historicity. Dasein as fate incorporates into its existence birth and death and their between, and holds them as thus incorporated, so that in such constancy, Dasein is indeed in a moment of vision for what is world historical in its current situation. In the fateful repetition of possibilities that have been, Dasein brings itself back immediately, that is to say, in a way that is temporally ecstatical to what already has been before it. This description of historicity in Being in Time is the foundation for Heidegger's understanding of folk in the 1934 seminar. Indeed, he admitted as much to Karl Löwit, for the capacity of Dasein to recognize itself as a part of a people and a state, and to envision a world historical destiny. In Lévinas's early essays on Heidegger, it was Heidegger's description of historical consciousness that Lévinas found most valuable. Heidegger's great accomplishment, he writes in the 1932 essay, Martin Heidegger and Ontology, was to have replaced the consciousness of traditional philosophy, indifferent to the destiny and the history of concrete man, with Dasein, for whom understanding is always understanding its possibilities. The inner illumination of consciousness with Dasein, quote, becomes inseparable from the destiny and history of concrete man. Lévinas here shows only enthusiasm for the historicist dimension of Heidegger's thought, and he repeats the phrase destiny and history of modern man to further highlight its significance. Thus, when Lévinas established the parallel in his journal between Dasein and being Jewish, we can only assume that he had not abandoned his enthusiasm for the contextual element of Heidegger's thinking, even if he rejected its terms. It's clear from the notes in his journal that Rosenzweig had additionally become a key intermediary for Lévinas in his project to write a phenomenology of being Jewish. And thus, he had by this time embraced a vision of Judaism as the tradition, the people that resist the Hegelian movements of history. At the same time, the sense in which this representation of the Jew could serve as a foundation for an account of Jewish being, one might even say a myth, remains an element of his meditations. In the journals, Lévinas explored a myriad of sources toward the same, and one of the most fascinating comments comes from his reading of Léon Blois. In commenting on Blois' letters to his fiancée, from 1889 to 1890, he notes what Blois had done for Christianity, that he had, without constructing a system, provided an account of mystery in concrete lived experience. For Blois, he notes, all of man is put in the categories of Catholicism, while the rest of us remain on the surface of these categories. The Christian, in revealing the meaning of mystery and transcendence, lives these categories at a deeper level. Same work is here to be done for Judaism, Lévinas writes. We could read Lévinas's entire project in light of this comment, most certainly his notion of being Jewish. This model gave him a dual path through the category of religion, which he defines universally in Totality Infinity as the bond that is elsewhere between the same and the other without constituting a totality. But everywhere insists is Jewish in derivation. It allowed him to use Judaism to describe humanity, but also to make a particular claim for the Jewish people as the people that lives religion at a deeper level. The Jew thus becomes exemplary for the human. But in place of Heidegger's notion of dwelling or Blois of mystery, Lévinas focused on persecution and deracination. In being Jewish, he articulated his own model of this, his own formulation of this model, which you have as the second quote there. Jewish existence is thus the fulfillment of the human condition as fact, personhood, and freedom, and its entire originality consists in breaking with a world that is without origin and simply present. It is situated from the very start in a dimension that Sartre cannot comprehend. It is not situated there for theological reasons, but for reasons of experience. Its theology explicates its facticity. We can read here something like a synthesis of Blois and Heidegger with the reversal of value, where Heidegger insisted in 1934 on the factical conditions that allow the German people to fulfill the potential of Dasein as folk. Lévinas insists that factical conditions enable the Jews to fulfill the human condition, one understood as the antithesis of Heidegger's. But we also see here the relation between the universal and the particular that Lévinas wanted to replicate from Blois, the sense in which one could argue for the Jew as an intensification of the human by way of Judaism's theological categories. Sean Hand, in a recent essay, noted the historical irony of Lévinas's fixation on Blois during the war, when Ernst Jünger, the notorious nationalist writer, friend, and correspondent of Carl Schmitt and Martin Heidegger, was at the very same time, less than 50 miles away, also writing in his diary about Blois. For Hand, there's a poignancy to the fact that Lévinas found meaning in Blois from a state of concrete and very real suffering, while Jünger indulged in an aesthetic fascination and meditation on the topic from a situation of physical comfort and ease. We can read Lévinas's own reflections on Blois as a move from the aesthetic of suffering to its ethic. In Blois, the suffering exalted in his work as a feminine suffering, the impoverished prostitute, of whom Mary Magdalene is the archetype. When Lévinas says in Being Jewish that Judaism's theology explicates its facticity, he reverses Blois' paradigm as it is expressed in his letters and novels. But this reversal ironically returns him to a Heideggerian paradigm in which facticity takes precedence as a means of thinking about culture. Just as Heidegger's folk have a historically determined capacity to embody a particular destiny, so do Lévinas's Jews. In Blois, the identification with the suffering martyr is performed by way of a metaphorical transposition, an identification working through the literary medium, thus Jünger's capacity to participate despite the difference in his own historical position. The role of Blois in Lévinas's notebooks raises the question of the role of literature for Lévinas. What we see in his journals and elsewhere in his early work is that literature served as a means for him to locate descriptions of factical experience, of insomnia, of sociality, and of suffering. And yet, in redeploying these descriptions toward the articulation of his description of being Jewish, Lévinas is driven to reject literature as a potential rival of religion. Dreamlike displacements. Lévinas's wartime diaries contain extensive notes on literary works, as well as notes for his own novels, and Existence and Existence is rife with literary references, which Lévinas depended upon to express the phenomenological descriptions of the work. There are references to Baudelaire, Valéry, Rimbaud, on fatigue and indolence, and to Shakespeare, Blanchot, and Maupassant on the rustling of the anonymity of being. Meanwhile, as is well known, both in his work and in essays published around the same time, Lévinas was formulating his harshest critique of art in general and literature more specifically. In essays such as The Transcendence of Words, The Other in Proust, and Reality in its Shadow, he denigrates the aesthetic by reducing it to the visual, insisting on its inability to achieve real transcendence. In The Transcendence of Words, an essay on Michel Leiris, his poetic autobiography, Beffeur, published in Les Temps Modernes in 1949, and thus a part of the debate about the social and political nature of literature, inaugurated by Sartre in the magazine, Lévinas contrasts writing in the living word, describing language as disfigured or frozen when it is transformed into documents and vestiges. As Georges Bataille read Lévinas's ambivalence toward art, particularly toward the poetic in one of the first reviews of Existence and Existence in 1949, it was a manifestation of the anxiety that was concomitant with his project of trying to develop a space of exteriority to philosophical discourse, an endeavor which implies abandoning oneself to knowledge. Quote, "Nothing remains that is up to reason," this is from Bataille, "but reason no longer renders an account of the fact of the world up to reason." This is what Bataille wrote of the project. This is a critique that Derrida would develop more systematically a decade and a half later. Lévinas's anxious efforts to distinguish a dissolution of the subject in art that would express a state preceding its inauguration from a dissolution of a subject in religion, which would break one out of the solipsism of intentional subjectivity, is, Bataille suggests, an unavoidable necessity, an attempt at a kind of recuperation of meaning, but one which would never be secure nor grounded, made purely by rhetorical means. Literature thus represents the threat that once one abandons the realm of knowledge, the exterior becomes a night in which all cows are black. Literature thus has to be at least rhetorically defeated to make a case for an exteriority of transcendence, which Lévinas would thus name religion. This explanation, already in 1949, cogently explains on philosophical grounds a dismissal of literature, contemporaneous with its role as source. Other more historical reasons are clearly to play a role in Lévinas's denigration of literature, particularly a desire to distance himself from Heidegger's treatment of the poetic, manifest, for example, in Lévinas's essay The Poet's Vision on Blanchot and Heidegger. As in The Transcendence of Words, Lévinas treats literature here as a rival. He concedes, by way of Blanchot's work, that literature can give voice to the eternal streaming of the outside, that this vision is indeed a call away from the Heideggerian universe, but it cannot, he insists, perform the work of religion, of the Jewish canon in particular. But what Derrida demonstrates in Violence and Metaphysics, and I would argue in all of his subsequent essays on Lévinas, is that literature would continue to haunt Lévinas's construction of religion, particularly as Lévinas reapplies the category of religion to the project of being Jewish. There are multiple ways in which Derrida illustrates this haunting, even when the term literature does not appear in the essays themselves. We can see Derrida's insistence on this dynamic even in the juxtaposition of his essay, Edmond Jabez, in The Question of the Book, with Violence and Metaphysics and Writing Indifference. Derrida concludes the Jabez essay with the claim that literature is the dreamlike displacement of religion, what he calls, following Jabez, the interrogation of God, the means of its survival, its afterlife. This resonates with the argument of Violence and Metaphysics that alterity only, quote, differs from itself, defers itself, and writes itself as différence. Thus, when Derrida both opens and concludes Violence and Metaphysics with the claim that the Hebraic only survives philosophical discourse as dream and in the dreamlike, we can assume that there's a reference back to Jabez and, indeed, to literature as religion's afterlife. Derrida closes the volume with a citation from Jabez, which is itself a quote from Reb Derrida, a made-up rabbi from the Book of Questions, whose name echoes Derrida's own. In the essay, Derrida writes, "Poetry is to prophecy what the idol is to truth. In Derrida's work, this is not a summons to truth, but a reminder that the former is inextricably related to the latter. Derrida will not only remind Lévinas that he cannot successfully police the boundaries between religion and literature, he will perform and execute the crossing, both by demonstrating the persistence of a literary survival in Lévinas's own writing and by exploiting its implications. If there were time, I would take you through some of the sites of the performance in En ce moment me voici, in Adieu to Emmanuel Lévinas, in Abraham l'Autre, and Gift of Death. One key feature of all these essays is that the readings are not presented as critiques, even as they refuse to respect the letter of the law in Lévinas's own discourse. In each, Derrida asserts his proximity to Lévinas and highlights Lévinas's own use of irony. At stake in this insistence, which we see again in 1998 in Derrida's last Visits of the Colloque, is the claim that the exploitation of the opening of Lévinas's texts are indeed a form of loyalty to him and to the very notion of being Jewish, about which Derrida will insist with Jabez, the Jew's identification with himself does not exist. It is out of Derrida's own sense of commitment to an alterity that strolls between the words, but also which cannot be detached from them, that he reads Lévinas against the grain. As Derrida writes in En ce moment me voici, apparently he likes the tear, but he detests contamination. Yet what holds his writing in suspense is that one must welcome contamination, the risk of contamination, in enchaining the tears and regularly mending and resuming them within the philosophical text or tissue of a récit. This mending resumption is even the condition on which what is beyond essence may keep its chance against the enveloping seam of the thematic or dialectical. The tear must be saved, and to do so, one must play off seam against seam. The risk of contamination must be regularly accepted in order for the non-contamination of the other by the rule in the same to still have a chance. Is there a single unstated critique at the center of Derrida's treatment of Lévinas? If there is one, it is that Lévinas was not sensitive enough to the undecidability of what he disclosed through his phenomenology of the ethical encounter. That in fact he used irony not as a means of destabilization, but as a rhetorical tactic which seemed aimed at solidifying alliances and marking out distinctions in political and theological positions. In the textual dynamics described here, we can see both how and why irony would have been such an important rhetorical tool for Lévinas, as well as why it would serve as a means by which Derrida would himself, quote, contaminate Lévinas's text. As Derrida argues in En ce moment, in order for the relation with the other to inflect Lévinas's text, Lévinas requires a means of rending or interrupting the thematic flow of discourse. In order to signal that communication is always buttressed by what Lévinas calls le dire, the saying, the text must bear the mark of the ethical relation. Irony is one means of inflecting the text with that relation. But in order for irony to function, a meaning must appear that both crosses and supports the discursive plane, or as Derrida puts it, one must place seam against seam. However, such an endeavor can only take place at the risk of contamination. That risk of an ironic subversion of one's irony is one of the stakes of the game. And it is this game that Derrida insists that Lévinas's texts play. For Derrida, it is their saving grace and the means to ensure that being Jewish also means learning to live together. All the rest is literature. With this dynamic in mind, let us return finally to 1998, to Derrida's final appearance at the Colloque des Intellectuels Juifs de langue française. The theme of the meeting was indeed how to live together, and Derrida makes an argument for a politics of hospitality, one which itself can guard against some of the risks of being Jewish, which Derrida delineates. The risks of the living together of the Jews, be they of a symbiotic type, naturalized birth, blood, soil, nation, or conventional state, juridical in the modern sense, a certain communitarianism, a certain Zionism, a certain nationalism, and all that can follow as to the motifs of filiation through blood, appropriation of the place, and the motif of election, all run the risks of remaining caught. That such a sentiment was far from Lévinas's own stated concerns. Lévinas, who had devoted much of his energy in the post-war period toward cultivating Jewish communitarianism, lauding the return by Jewish youth to studying Judaism's great books, arguing for the spiritual exigencies of Zionism, this did not seem to trouble Derrida. Lévinas' text would and could speak to these concerns in and through a literary afterlife. As Derrida puts it in Literature in Secret, an essay written contemporaneously to his 1998 appearance at the Colloque, literature is religion's inheritor. It also betrays it. It betrays it in the double sense of the word. It is unfaithful to it. It breaks with it at the moment of manifesting its truth and of unveiling its secret. For Derrida, this is also its form of loyalty. Derrida demonstrates this relation to Lévinas himself in 1998. He went and told Lévinas's secret, that Lévinas's irony was also sometimes at the Colloque's expense. And he insisted that Lévinas would and should be read against a communitarian grain. It's striking that Derrida subtitled his paper for the Colloque, A Lesson. Lévinas himself repeatedly referred to his Talmudic readings as les leçons talmudiques. Derrida only omitted the canonical referent in his own text. He severed the context, but represented the form, providing it with an afterlife. Derrida made clear in his own statement before the Colloque the unease he felt in being there, that he could only be there by uprooting the very form of Lévinas's lesson from its canonical source. How was he to receive Lévinas's joke about being Jewish, he demands? A Jew, about which I know too well. and so closely that he was never sure of being together with himself insofar as he was a Jew, nor even with himself in general, who dares not stop at the hypothesis that this disassociation from self renders him at once as less Jewish and as most Jewish. How could such a split or divided Jew have received this remark? Derrida insisted here both on the ambiguity of Lévinas's irony and indeed on the ambiguity of being Jewish. The answer to the question depends, of course, on how one understands the relation between the spirit and the letter. And indeed, the difference between Lévinas and Derrida comes down to this. It had always come down to this, to Lévinas's insistence that the saying preceded the said, that the living voice accompanied its working as sign, as indication. And I'm reaching my close here. Derrida continued, how could he, Derrida, welcome its letter according to the spirit, here Paul comes in, of course, that was undeniably breathing in it, to wit, that nothing of all these differences, disassociations, or indecisions could damage the complicity of a certain living together. Irony for Lévinas marked the being together of the vocative statement, the fact that the unsaid could precede and repurpose what was said, but for Derrida, irony always functioned by calling that very dynamic into question. The survival of the trace was always already at work. Irony reveals that the spirit is always already the letter, that religion is always already literature. And of course, that what could it mean to revalorize the trope of the Jew if not to insist on the dead letter over the living spirit? Derrida subtitled his paper A Lesson, and he made Lévinas's own text the biblical canon upon which he comments. In fact, insofar as there is a kind of scriptural reference in Derrida's Lesson, it is Lévinas's own reading that occupies the canonical position. He quotes, in fact, from one of Lévinas's Talmudic readings, itself given in 1963, entitled Toward the Other. This is a quote, "The respect for the stranger and the sanctification of the name of the eternal form a strange equivalence, and all the rest is a dead letter. All the rest is literature." Derrida could have received this comment as a dismissal of his own project. Some years later, Lévinas outlined the difference between his project and Derrida's, referred to Derrida's purely literary effect, called it, no doubt with irony, a new Frisian, Derrida's poetry. It was on these grounds, indeed, that Derrida was dismissed as a Jewish thinker. Even Lescorre, Lévinas's biography, wrote that Derrida's face was one not seen at the colloque, the irony of which Derrida noted with some pleasure at the 1998 meeting. But this was not to say that Derrida did not engage with the figure of the Jew. If there is one point upon which Derrida, Lévinas, and indeed Heidegger all agree, it is that we receive tradition and culture before we articulate it. Derrida described his own being Jewish as a yes that comes through every no and survives through all the negation, all the negative modalities of a disavowal. The issue then is one of the means of reception. If Derrida insisted on calling Lévinas back to the literary remainders of his own work, to its textuality, it was out of commitment to the idea that this was indeed another way of occupying one's facticity, one which insisted indeed on the dead letter over against the living spirit. One final irony here is that Lévinas's focus on the living spirit was less a way forward than a means of trying to re-inhabit the past, to read Talmud, to engage in ritual. And Derrida's emphasis on the dead letter was in fact an opening toward the future, through the closure of the past. Beyond the question then of whether or not to revalorize the trope of the Jew, there is a broader question that the 30-year conversation of these two thinkers opens for us. The question of how to relate to the task of tradition. My project going forward is to ask how the categories of religion and literature orient us towards that task and to flesh out the political ramifications of aligning oneself with one rather than the other. Thank you.
The paper was very, very dense. A few comments then. About this reading, beautiful readings of Derrida's ironic reading of Lévinas' irony. Especially accompanying, I think, is your demonstration that Lévinas has transvalued or perhaps reversed Heidegger's ontology by using Judaism as a universal, as a human category to counter mythic understanding of Dasein as folk, right? So first, I have noticed in a work that I had done a long time ago that as early as 34, 35, Lévinas had operated a strange move. you may recall that he discussed ontology and the need to escape being, and he talked about being riveté, l'être rivé. A couple of years later, in his réflexion sur la philosophie de l'hitlérisme, reflection on the philosophy of Hitlerism, being riveted or être rivé becomes being riveted to Judaism. Être rivé au judaïsme. So since reflections on philosophy of Hitlerism is a political essay that denounces the way in which the Nuremberg laws entrap the subject within biological genetic determinations. Right? So this is an interesting move on which you may want to comment further. The passage from Dasein to being Jewish starts, I would argue, before the wartime notebooks. So my second point is this. I see in your paper a difficulty. It's a difficulty to translate into English the word communautarism. And if you experience this difficulty, it's not because it's your translation, it's because it's our problem, our difficulty, all of us. It's also the difficulty of Derrida's translator, obviously. Sometimes we say communitarianism, we don't exactly know how to translate that. And I think it's because there is simply no easy translation of this concept in proper American English. So what I want to say is very simple. There seems to be a blind spot in Derrida's reading of Jewishness, and perhaps, since you seem to endorse that reading to an extent, perhaps even against Lévinas, in your reading of Jewishness and of the Jewish figure, that blind spot, I would argue, consists in the utter Frenchness of Derrida's elaboration of Jewish identity. Derrida's Jewishness seems, to me at least, something like the internalized French Republican version of universalism. To read Lévinas as, you say, against the communitarian grain, contre le communautarisme, would mean to attempt at Gallicizing Lévinas under the pretense of salvaging from Lévinas' Jewish universalism, that is the universalist Jewish thinker. So to save Lévinas from a certain particularism, a certain communautarism that would run the risk of being folkish or Zionist or even Gallic, such seems to me at least Derrida's endeavor. So perhaps you would want to comment on those, and I will stop here. We can continue otherwise.
Sure. Yeah. So I totally agree about the. I totally agree about the genesis of being Jewish, and I've written about it elsewhere. It's already been published in a journal. So yes, that's absolutely the case. But the point of what I wanted to show is that it's still a acceptance of the historicality of Lévinas's. I mean, of Heidegger's category. That Lévinas wants to utilize that same mode in endorsing being Jewish, and I don't think that it itself is a pure universalism. I think it's a form of exemplarity, which I think is a complex relationship to universality, which leads me to your next point. I absolutely disagree that Derrida's reading of Lévinas is to try to give it a kind of Gallic universalism. I think that was in some sense was supposedly the point of my talk, was to argue that in fact Derrida, as he says very clearly when he was there in 1998, that he fully and totally accepts his Jewish facticity. And this is, of course, is all over his work on language. It's all over particularly a text like Monolingualism of the Other, that the point is not a choice between universalism and particularism. The point is a mode of inhabiting particularism. And that is the point upon which I would insist, and that is in some sense the point of trying to enable the category of literature as an afterlife of religion. One doesn't uproot religion, one occupies it differently. And that is why irony is so important, and that, to comment on your reading of May 68, I think that it's interesting. I am, in fact, not a literary scholar in some sense, in the sense that my position is not in literature, but it's so odd to me that scholars of literature seem to sort of miss the kind of play that's at stake in these kinds of utterances, and how that play does not merely force one into one choice or the other, the choice of universal versus the particular. It actually allows one to engage in the impossibility of being in that universalism. The point of my analysis of the German Jew, in the figural Jew, is that in fact nobody in that audience actually thought that they were German Jews. Everybody knew, of course, had to know that in some sense this is an ironic gesture, and that has political importance, and it's one that doesn't absolutely disenable a particularism. It's one that reminds us of particularism, but asks us to think about it in a way that doesn't merely confirm it blankly and try to reify it and try to unify it and try to come up with a definition for it.
No, you're absolutely right. I was mainly talking of the afterlife of the struggle of the 68.
You're talking
and of the revival, absolutely, of the revival of the struggle. But for the struggle itself, I would totally agree with you. Absolutely.
Do you want to, otherwise no one will have a chance.
Yeah, I'm not going to intervene in this conversation, so I have a completely different approach. So what do you suggest as our chair?
Perhaps you can
I'll just
make your comments and then we'll take questions from the floor.
Well, I want to thank the organizers for inviting you to participate from a different world. I teach in the Classical and Near Eastern Studies department, so I'm coming at this from an historical perspective, I guess. I want to begin with words of appreciation for Sarah's engaging presentation, which I found quite rich with insight. I find many implications for our current conversations in ancient studies about identity as constructed and contested in the spaces of religion, literature, philosophy, and that most elusive of subjects are so-called real life. Her treatment of the dialogue between Lévinas and Derrida in a period of anguished reconsideration of Heidegger's legacy, especially in the light of recently confirmed and direct evidence of Heidegger's complicity in the assault of National Socialism on the very being of Jews and Judaism, their actuality in the world, is nuanced, probing, and to me at least quite instructive. Throughout her presentation, Sarah employs the vibrantly active polarities of letter and spirit, materiality and essence, past and present, life and death, and perhaps also nation and citizen. Everywhere, too, we need to negotiate the probability of ironic subversion of both the categories and how they might best be employed or redeployed. The overriding question, however, she makes clear in her conclusion, is how such tensions connect to the cultural categories of religion and literature as representing living spirit or life on the one side, or instead dead letter and potentially a tradition in danger of extinction on the other side. It will be no surprise to those who have read Sarah's book, The Figural Jew, or other treatments of French philosophy and literary theory in recent decades, that these themes and polarities might remind us of the struggles and proposals of a man who some might call the most infamous Jew of antiquity. To me as well, as a scholar of the religions of the ancient Mediterranean world, with a special interest in Hellenistic Judaism and the emergence of Christianity, all these dynamic oppositions allude remarkably well to the language of the Apostle Paul. This is the figure that Alan Siegel once called Paul the Apostle and the Apostate. In fact, the announcement of this symposium, as we've been reminded, tells us that troping the Jew has a long history that can be traced back to Paul and then to the influence of Pauline dialectic on Christian European anti-Judaism. So there's no need for me to flesh out the particularities of how Lévinas and Derrida and several other participants in this post-war reconstruction of the trope of the Jew use the symbols and tensions of Pauline discourse to animate their concepts. Instead, I would like to return the favor through reversal and point the direction of my remarks back to some of the generative tensions and creative inconsistency within Paul's own thought and action. I'd like to turn the direction of my remarks for a moment and use the insights of Sarah's paper to enlighten aspects of Paul himself as character. Paul can work here as a representative of past or text or even dead letter that needs waking up through devices of ironic distance and explication of nuance and contradiction. As Sarah puts the matter so pointedly, and I quote, "One final irony is that Lévinas' focus on the living spirit was less a way forward than a means of trying to re-inhabit the past, and Derrida's emphasis on the dead letter was in fact an opening toward the future through the closure of the past. Beyond the question then of whether or not to revalorize the trope of the Jew, there is a broader question, as she puts it, of how to relate to the task of tradition and how the categories of religion and literature orient us toward that task." Paul himself experimented with these categories as he sought somehow to connect his ideals and religious practice with the divine text of his inherited tradition. In this process, he inscribed upon himself many of the protean features of the trope of the Jew, as has been so brilliantly discussed by Daniel Boyarin in his book, Paul, a Radical Jew, and by my own teacher and colleague, Calvin Retzler, in his book, Paul, a Jew on the Margins. Paul comes to us, of course, as literature, as letter, as word, as text. Though he worked to animate what he called, by means of ironic hyperbole, the dead letter of the scripture through notions of an activating spirit, he himself was entombed in an artificial construct as part of the emergent collection of New Testament scripture. This process converted Paul from a man who called himself a Hebrew of Hebrews, circumcised on the 8th day, and a Pharisee in matters of obedience to Torah, Philippians chapter 3, into something different. By this process, Paul, a man who challenged social norms with a radical asceticism and complicated notions of opposition of the marginal to violent forces of empire, becomes a surprisingly urbane, indeed bourgeois citizen of Rome, engineer of the displacement of Semitic Judaism with a thoroughly Gentile Christianity, and defender of what today we call traditional family values, marriage and child rearing, as well as the building and endorsement of institutional structures of power. This Pauline conversion is effected most egregiously in the pastoral epistles of the New Testament, addressed to Timothy and Titus, composed in his name, a generation or more after his death. No doubt the Paul of history and of being in the world, and not only that literary artifact, the Paul who found himself entombed and defamed of his troubling apocalypticism and social radicalism by Christian proto-orthodoxy, no doubt Paul did willy-nilly set in motion forces that permitted and perhaps demanded transformation of a Palestinian Jewish wisdom sect centered on a proto-rabbinic sage into a Roman imperial mystery religion. But this Paul, in his lived experience, was most decisively described in advance of ironic embrace and displacement of tradition via this very tension between religion and literature. To put it crudely, Paul wanted to have his cake, if not his potato pancake, and he wanted to eat it too. Sarah emphasizes in her book that the figure of the Jew in post-Enlightenment Christian Europe is an uprooted nomad and marginalized prophet, and these terms apply to Paul as living subject quite well. A figure of diaspora, practiced and fluent in ancestral traditions as well as the dominant Hellenistic culture, quite importantly, an imperial subject, vulnerable to the complications of pride and self-doubt that are emblematic of privileged colonial hybridity. Paul calls himself and his followers citizens not of Jerusalem, nor of Rome, but of the polity of heaven. Philippians 3 again. This means in practical terms that he has no city, no identity. He is a person without papers, or more precisely, his right to proffer papers of Jewish or Roman or whatever identity is constantly in question. This placement in no place uncovers a man who is nomad and thus in danger of dissolving into no man and no one. Sarah relates how Lévinas represented the figure of the Jew as a model for the ethical subject and identity formation. I find this language a powerful and precise description of what is happening to Paul. His religious experience, both in his private capacity and as developed in conversations with others, emerges as a site for ethical formation and introspection about identity and its consequences, as has been well documented by Stan Stowers in his book, Rereading Romans. So one example. In Galatians 3 and 4, Paul, as a reader of the book of Genesis, famously detours around Mount Sinai and God's covenant with Moses and the people of the Exodus to reflect on Abraham and his place as father of Israel. Despite the central act of ritual circumcision embodied in Abraham and Isaac as mark of that more ancient covenant, Paul, with an ironic displacement worthy of Jacques Derrida, claims that for the new or indeed the true children of Abraham, circumcision is no longer useful or meaningful. Circumcision entails a heavy burden of law for the Jews in Paul's rhetoric, but on the other hand is not properly available to Gentiles. So he imagines a new Abrahamic people apart from the law, the circumcision of the Spirit, creating what he terms no longer the people of Moses, but in Galatians 6, the Israel of God. I find it interesting that Paul argues here in much the same terms that Lévinas took from the law. As Sarah summarizes it, Lévinas' notion of being Jewish, and I quote, allowed him to use Judaism to describe humanity, but also to make a particular claim for the Jewish people as the people that lives religion at a deeper level. The Jew thus becomes exemplary for the human. Paul would very much agree with this position, while simultaneously deracinating the ethnic category to present his ideal Jew as exactly Lévinas's intensification of the human. Paul authorizes this move by appeal to the freedom of the spirit that erases difference of Jew or Gentile, slave or free, even male and female, as a new human being in Christ. Galatians 3. But this lively spirit quickly hardens into a fixed letter that ever more powerfully ensures a move away from Torah and ritual into a new space that experiences Jewish tradition and law now merely as literature and no longer as religion. So in closing, I want to thank Sarah once again for her engaging and fruitful analysis of the conversation between Lévinas and Derrida in terms of the trope of the Jew and the dangers inherent in the space between religion and literature. As I hope you've seen, I find her presentation quite intriguing, as offering a set of questions with which to interrogate once again the figure who has become all too often the dead letter of this process, rather than the live and explosive force he must have been felt to be in his own lifetime. Thank you.
I'm not sure I have much to say in terms of comments, except that that's really helpful, and I think it's actually a nice way to get back into this revalorization of Paul, and how it's sort of the sequel chapter to the revalorization of the Jew, to remind us, in fact, that there is just as much nuance in that story as there is nuance in the revalorization of the Jew, so I really appreciate it.
I think we can take questions, and perhaps the microphone would be useful. Laura, would you perhaps pass the microphone around?
That was fascinating, and every bit as well executed as your book. Makes me want to read it. I'm very intrigued by the Blois connection. I had seen it in the Carnet, which I haven't read in any depth. The other figure who really was marked by Blois, well, there was Junger, and I think you can read all of the wartime journals as a kind of series of prolegomena to a reading of Léon Blois, of whom he says that after the war, people have understood that what the war was all about was Léon Blois. The other figure was Lacan. Lacan was fascinated by Blois, and you can see why in many ways. Sort of Baroque prose, heretical in relation to the institutions of psychoanalysis on the one hand, the Catholic Church on the other. As for what the Jews represented for him, my sense is that the Jew was above all the abject figure who prevented the letter of the préfigurant, the letter of the prefigurative term from reaching its destination in the spirit of what was to be prefigured in the New Testament. That was a subject of great tension in Blois. But it's also what you find in Lacan, if you consider the lettre en souffrance, the purloined letter never arriving at its destination and being kept from arriving at its theoretical meaning. Well, as a question, that's not a question. Let me give you a question. Do you remember that passage written by Lévinas in the volume of L'Arc, a tribute to Derrida, in which he compares the arrival of Derrida on the scene of philosophy to the experience of the Exodus not in the Bible, but in World War II. That is, one day life was normal in every small French town. The Vicomte spoke to Vicomte, barbers were cutting hair, and the next day, after the arrival of the Germans, there was nothing left. Everything had been evacuated. And he says that is the effect of Derrida on philosophy.
Evacuation.
Well, worse than evacuation, I mean the beginning of the end.
I was punning. So.
Yeah, right. So my question is, how do you think that Derrida took that? How should he have taken it? How do you take it?
Yeah. I'm fascinated by this passage actually, and I've thought a lot about it. And part of the passage is, and I quoted from it, that's where he...
Frisson, the word frisson.
Yeah, exactly.
I thought you were about to arrive.
Yeah, right, exactly. And you know, the other part of it is the barber sign, free shave tomorrow, right? Everywhere people were receiving a shave because of the barber sign, free shave tomorrow. But in fact, in some sense, the apocalypse had arrived. That's in some sense the joke at the center of that essay. Yeah, I mean, I've sort of gone back and forth on it. The question is it an extravagant compliment, or is it a kind of horrific dismissal? And I think that there's both in there, but I guess what I do think is that I think he essentially, who does Derrida become in the image that is created very powerfully by this idea of the moment after the invasion? He becomes the guy who's walking through the deserted streets kicking a can. In other words, he's playing when something radically politically important happened. I think that's when he says his vision, his poetry, it's essentially his play in some sense. And so I think ultimately it is finally a discount that literature is play, and that what Derrida does is play, and Lévinas thinks there's a lot more important stuff to be done.
So I think this will build on those comments. First of all, I'm sorry for my voice. I'm glad I have a mic. The question will be short. I greatly enjoyed the presentation. But apropos of what you were asked, and you answered about this continuing agonistic relationship with literature, much of what you quoted in that regard is from the 1940s. So is all this obliquely related or not obliquely related to the Holocaust? Why at this time, with this passion, with this vehemence? What is really behind that?
Yeah, so my answer to that question is that it's tied to the whole debate surrounding Sartre and the Temps Moderne and the what is literature, that sets off a kind of conversation about literature. And I guess my reading is that both Lévinas and Derrida engage in the conversation that gets initiated by Sartre's essays. And that I think that what Lévinas saw is essentially that there is this. You see this in all these journals which are in some sense being run by philosophers like Critique and the Temps Moderne. And yet all of a sudden these philosophers are interested in two things. They're interested in the sacred and they're interested in literature. They're interested in Wallace Stevens. They're interested in poetry, they're interested in Kafka. And in some sense the question is, and why? Why is this sort of dual appearance in all these journals in this period in the late 40s? And I think that it's this sense already that the philosophical corpus, the philosophical mode of engagement, isn't going to serve the day. That there has to be, the rationality is already under attack. And so that there are essentially two discourses. I mean, you know, you have all of this language of the deluge. I mean, so Jean Val, when he starts a journal after the war, he calls it Deucalion. I mean, there's the sense in which we must rebuild the world. And the question is, what tools are we going to use? And we have the Christian existentialists who are arguing in some sense that there is a form of Christianity that is untouched, unmarred by this history. So you have that version of religion, and you have this kind of exploration of literature and poetry as a sort of another spiritual source. And I think that Lévinas is already kind of fighting a battle that yes, there is a way in which religion is going to be the answer, but it's going to be the answer via Judaism. Judaism is going to be the answer because Judaism is far more unmarred in some sense than the Catholic tradition of personalism.
Thanks for that. So I've been reading this book by your colleague David Nuremberg, sort of anti-Judaism, which is a long and extremely doleful account of ways in which Jews and Judaism have been instantiated over time from roughly the Egyptians to roughly yesterday in tropes that are sort of not just tropes, but figures of thought, actual constructions that are remarkably stable over time. In other words, analysis. And what one says about Paul, one could say about Luther, one could say about French anti-Semitism and so on. And so, as I was thinking about that, and as I was listening to your talk, I was thinking about the cultural surround of European culture and Christianity, Christian culture. I'm an Anglo-American critic, mainly, so I keep thinking about T.S. Eliot and people like that. But it's all kind of the same. And the associations are really kind of the same. So I was wondering, against that backdrop, how one might read the conversation between Lévinas and Derrida as a conversation that's not just infra-dig between two Jews sitting in the back of the room exchanging, talk with each other, but as a serious kind of jokey but serious kind of revisionary account of what options there are in a culture not to be Protestant or Catholic. And the contestation is really between Lévinas's, way of doing that and Derrida's way of doing that, of which I'm a little suspicious because all this talk about the Arab, we'll talk about sort of the Arabic slash Jewish stuff. Seems like a little weird distancing, although maybe not from the fate of being Jewish in France at that particular moment, although I know that's very controversial. Anyway, like previous question, that's not really a question, but an opportunity, I hope you would just sort of rather think a little bit about those issues.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, and I think that that I have to admit, I have Nuremberg's book on my shelf, but I haven't read it yet, to admit. But I think that, yes, I mean, in some sense, what they both do is fundamentally accept that there isn't any escaping this history, right? And there's no escaping the sense in which that marks what Jewishness means. And the question is, how does one engage it going forward?